John, really appreciate you hopping on to join me tonight for this episode of the Cameron Brown Show. We've been talking about this for a little while now, and just really appreciate you joining me for the show.
My pleasure.
John and I met roughly 5 years ago, a little over that now, when I moved to Boston after graduating from school. Got my first job there and actually met in Harvard Square. Somehow started a conversation, and it's led to back and forth over the years via email and plenty of really good conversations. We had a conversation recently about basically doing a series of shows and of episodes that cover different topics from locations, geopolitical locations around the world, different events that are going on, different things that are going on internationally that we really think that people need to know more about in general. And the first of those happens to be the Gaza and Israel situation and the U.S.'s involvement in that particular region. And obviously, there's plenty more to come after this. But we're going to start with that topic tonight. But just to give a little background on John and who he is, John Sheehan is a senior consulting strategist for foreign central banks, U.S. allies and partners, American banks, U.S. manufacturers, and U.S. government agencies. He has worked as a bank regulator and consultant to the U.S. government and to U.S. allies and partners. He has advised Wall Street firms and U.S.-based manufacturers on how to avoid offshoring to China, Vietnam, Laos, and Europe. He's a specialist in Asian financial markets, Russian studies, European politics, and the Middle East, North African regions. He's authoring forthcoming books on radical movements, Anglo-American global strategic problems, and new soft power strategies for the Middle East. And he's also working on strategies to rebuild the U.S. defense industrial base, a proposal for an American Foreign Legion, and a new U.S. strategy for Eurasia. John, looking forward to diving into this topic tonight. Once again, we're going to cover the Israel and Gaza situation and America's involvement. And I'll kind of let you take it over from here.
Well, glad to help, Cameron, because I think Americans are involved in their own issues. And sometimes, I think too much, we lose track of how much power we have on the course of events in the world. And if Americans go abroad, they won't get over how much people are talking about how our policies influence them.
Right.
And they want one thing above all, it's for Americans to listen to them and to understand what we do and what we don't do, and how we need to pay more attention to that, because it blows back on us, and it matters to what we think of ourselves as a generous global power. And if we understand what we're doing and how people are reacting to it, it might help us understand why things do happen, like 9/11 and
Right.
Wars in places like Ukraine or Taiwan. Because Americans get indignant when things happen. They don't understand that people make things happen by making policy choices. And if they don't, read the right sources of information and listen to the right people, they'll constantly will be in the mode of constantly chasing events and
Yeah.
improvising strategies to, catch up
Right.
and making short-term deals instead of driving events abroad, which we ought to be doing in a strategic planning mode instead of a reactive mode.
You talk about all the time, well, you've talked about a good bit with me, just the importance of travel and getting outside of our comfort zone and better understanding other geographic locations around the world. Obviously, it's super important for people to do that. And I think when it comes to the Gaza and Israel situation, obviously, those are locations that are very difficult to travel to currently. Israel's always been, high on their security. But for those that are, obviously getting into and trying to better understand what's going on abroad, what would those resources be aside from a podcast like this? What would those resources be that would help them to better understand what's going on in those locations?
Well, first of all, you should travel as much as you can in the next 5 years as you can, because wars are going to break out more and more, bigger wars. And once those start, it's going to be very difficult to travel to certain places.
Right.
And that will eventually include Europe, which will be a tragedy, especially for young people. If you can borrow the money, rob it, whatever you have to do, travel while you can, and not when you're old and you can't appreciate it for the rest of your life. Nothing like travel expands your frames of reference and your understanding of the world better than getting on an airplane and traveling around. When you're young, too, you can go to stay inexpensively at youth hostels. People adopt you, be in groups, because the white slave trade is active in both Europe and Asia. So you got to be wary of that. But and listen, don't be the ugly American and pontificating how everyone ought to be grateful to us. Ask them, bring them questions, ask them what they think. You'll get an earful, and it will be difficult to hear for a while, but you'll learn a lot from it. And people can tell if you know what you're talking about overseas, and they'll respect you. I've never lost a relationship abroad by standing up for my country's honor, but I haven't lost it either by admitting that when we've flubbed it, because we've made a lot of mistakes. And when it's like anything, when you settle on the truth, you can reconcile your views with someone else, and then you can move forward with a more constructive dialogue.
Right.
So yes, please travel, and don't think it's going to be available forever, because the global situation is deteriorating, and once war starts, travel becomes more problematical.
And there's going to be plenty of conversations in the future about the other conflicts that are going on around the world. Specifically for tonight, obviously Gaza and Israel is the main focus. So, in kind of starting with the reason for all of this, right? The breakout of this conflict and this war. Can we start there and just kind of give a little bit of a background on what really happened? And obviously October 6th occurred, but there's plenty before that. So what has really led up to this final conflict that's occurring now in the
Well,
Middle East?
the first thing you have to understand is that it's not a senseless act of violence. It was inevitable. I don't know. There are a lot of people who obey their thought police and don't read the New York Times. Well, of course, the people who tell them not to read the Times read it every day. It's the most important paper of record in the world, and you'll never be able to catch up with everything that is in the Times, but it is a very important newspaper that the people who run the world read. And it was, I don't know, it's the summer of 2023. Tom Friedman, who's the ultimate kind of power columnist, met in the White House with President Biden and Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken, because they wanted to leak to him their legacy play for peace in the Middle East, which was a U.S. brokering of normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now, the context of this is under Donald Trump. The Israelis persuaded Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in the United States to broker a normalization of relations between Israel and the Emirates in the Gulf, the UAE and Qatar and the other Gulf oil monarchies, and this was in addition to the Israeli Egyptian Camp David Accords,
Right.
whereby the Egyptians made peace with Israel and normalized relations. And for the past 50 years, the pressure on Israel to negotiate in good faith with the Palestinians for a sovereign state next to them was something that all of the frontline Arab states insisted on as a, a requirement before they would normalize relations with them. Naturally, the Israelis have used American power to get these Arab states to normalize relations with them, uh, while making, vague promises to the Palestinians that they would give them a state. But as we know from the past 50 years, and now explicitly, as stated by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israelis never had any intention of giving the Palestinians a sovereign state next door to them. And they have been mostly explicit about this, but certainly implicit, and lately explicit. And one by one, the Israelis got the United States to, exert the pressure on these Arab states to do this and normalize their relationship with Israel, and put the question of Palestinian statehood on the sidelines. And at the same time, the Israelis have, even though they agreed in the Camp David Accords to stop making these illegal settlements on the West Bank, since Jimmy Carter brokered that peace treaty, the settlements have gone up from, a few thousand to over 800,000. And I'll go into the negotiations, why this matters to the peace negotiations later. But Israel has succeeded in planting almost 1 million Israelis on the West Bank, all over that territory, and the security protocols and the geographical blockages between the Palestinians doing anything on their own territory, they have been so complete that they make the possibility of Palestinian sovereignty an impossibility. There's no contiguous Palestinian land now anyway, and the Israelis always divert negotiations by inventing endless security protocols to protect these illegal settlements in their negotiations, in a way that runs out the clock on all negotiations, and it basically sabotages any treaty between the Palestinians and the Israelis completely, which is the goal. And by destroying the possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state on the West Bank that way, and by strategically isolating the Palestinians by getting the United States to broker normalization of relations with all the other Arab states, with Israel, the Palestinians could see their future being traded away at a negotiating table to which they were conspicuously not invited. And when Tom Friedman published this article, the only demand for a Palestinian state was an Israeli promise not to bring these matters so far that it would be impossible to have a state, and no specifics or no concrete measures, no timelines, no withdrawal schedule for any of these settlers were written down. The Palestinians could see that they were being abandoned by their fellow Arabs, that the United States, position with them being as endlessly quoted as, the United States is the only country capable of delivering meaningful secure concessions to the Palestinians from the Israelis, that had become a joke. I mean, the United States pressed the Palestinians, the Israelis, to make any concessions to the Palestinians or to anybody. And so the Palestinians could see their future disappearing before their eyes. And the Saudi kingdom was the last sovereign Arab country uh, to demand a Palestinian state as in exchange for normalized diplomatic relations. And now that was going away. So as soon as I saw that article, I said, we're going to have a war, because out of desperation, the Arabs, the Palestinians would have to put themselves back on the agenda by fighting for their sovereignty. And as it turns out, the Israelis had captured a war plan that Hamas had drawn up, and its intelligence branch had done a very good job preparing for, and that a bunch of women in Shin Bet and the Mossad intelligence service had uh, discovered, brought to the attention of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And but he not only refused to listen to it, but he shut down the unit that was bringing this information to the Israeli Defense Force, which he also refused to allow to drill for this scenario. And he he continued to transfer billions of dollars in Palestinian taxes and foreign aid from the United States, which he kept. He was supposed to give it to the Palestinian National Authority, which is the political administrative arm of the PLO, which after the Oslo Accords in 1994, on television stood up in a unanimous vote to recognize Israel's right to exist and to state unequivocally that they were willing to negotiate with the Israelis for a two-state solution. But Netanyahu has made it a policy to systematically humiliate and undermine the PLO and the PNA and the Palestinian administrative headquarters in Ramallah, and elevate in Palestine's consciousness and the American consciousness the role of Hamas, so that he could define the enemy as an implacable one. Use the river from to the sea rhetoric. Although Hamas's version of the river to the sea doesn't sound too much different from the Israeli version of the river to the sea, which, since Netanyahu says he wants to block any sovereignty and ultimately annex the West Bank, which would constitute an Israeli state from the river to the sea. So they're fighting over land, and this is directly contrary to what the United States promised the Palestinians, and that the Israelis accepted as a condition of the aid, the billions of dollars of aid that we give them, which is north of $80 billion now, which, if you count it since it was before even 1948 when we recognized them, is nearly $500 billion in current dollars. And whenever we pressure them, Netanyahu kind of waves his hands, yeah, whatever. And and all of the American negotiators are invariably Jewish themselves, so the Palestinians don't exactly trust our even-handedness. And there's yet to be any evidence that we've pressured the Israelis to make any meaningful concessions or negotiate in good faith. And I can go into that, the procedures by which the Israelis stall such negotiations. And obviously there's been no restraint by the United States on the Israelis' actions since October 7th. I mean, all you have to do is look at Gaza, and it's a moonscape. And radical Israeli settlers, most of whom, by the way, or no, I shouldn't say most of whom, many of whom are these ultra-Orthodox who don't even serve in the Israeli army, don't work. They just study the Torah all day, but they do this weekend warrior thing of driving Palestinians off their own land. They sexually humiliate them. They terrorize them with guns in midnight raids, and terrorize and kill people while the Israeli police, the Shin Bet, and the IDF watch on. So, and during the war, the Israeli security chief, Itamar Ben-Gvir, wanted 70,000 guns from the United States to arm these Israeli settlers. And any guns that didn't have U.S. Army markings on them, they put them on there because they implicate us in everything they do. Even in the Lebanese Civil War, the Lebanese factions they considered the American University of Beirut to be their most precious institution, and so none of them used it as as a as a base or a hiding spot for their different factions, except for one. The Israelis bombed the library to announce that we can do anything we want to you, and the Americans will go on along with it.
So,
Well, this is the impression that we've created. So, there has been no American pressure on the Israelis to concede anything. And the idea that the raid on October 7th was senseless, is just not true. It was inevitable. And we, unfortunately, by not, forcing the Israelis to negotiate good faith, we kind of let it happen. And Netanyahu, who doesn't want to go to jail, prolonged the war to get everything done. He has successfully destroyed a lot of Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, which isn't probably a bad thing. And there is a ceasefire going because, and I have to give credit for Trump for this, because Netanyahu was more afraid of Trump saying, "Look, I want a deal and I want it now," and Trump said, do it, and Netanyahu did a ceasefire. I mean, he's done everything he wanted to do, so it's not like he's made any meaningful concessions to the Palestinians, but at least Trump put a stop to it. I'll give Trump credit for that. But anyway, that's how the war got started. Going into the issues of how the negotiations are kind of a kabuki play and a farce, that's something I'll go into that later. But it was not an outbreak of senseless violence. There was a strategic and a geopolitical rationale behind it.
so before we get into that, some of obviously your opinions are what some might consider to be controversial to a certain degree. They're not what you hear on a daily basis. Also, a lot of what you just said, obviously a lot of that was very factual. But it was very much pointed at the controversy and the issues related to how Israel has handled the entirety of the situation. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what comes next. What is the ultimate goal in your opinion? Because you also mentioned early on in the podcast that there's, in the next 5 years, we're most likely going to be an all-out war internationally. So let's travel as much as possible. So there's a lot of statements, or a few statements that are made along those lines. So what really comes next in your opinion as it relates to this conflict? Because of course, as of this past week, they've been trying to negotiate and they've been discussing peace talks. They've been releasing hostages, supposedly. But what comes next in all this, in your opinion?
Well, the Israeli thousands of hostages so that they look good when they get one Israeli soldier back. But most of these people that they arrest haven't actually done anything. They're just hostages. I mean, a huge percentage of Arab people in the West Bank are in jail in Israeli prisons at any one time. You can't make a posting on Facebook without Shin Bet monitoring you, and you can be picked up for the slightest pretext, and you don't even know why, but you're in jail, and this is just part of life on the West Bank. When I was at Bethany at the River Jordan, where John the Baptist was baptized Jesus, I was in Jordan, but my cell phone said, "Welcome to Israel." And the Israelis, I've heard this many times, that they want to attack Jordan, drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank and into Jordan, make that the Palestinian state, and then annex the West Bank. And when I've said, wait a minute, the Kingdom of Jordan made peace with Israel, and Jordan is a treaty ally of the United States, or virtually. I mean, what would that, what incentive would that give anyone to make a peace treaty with Israel? And the reaction I always get is shrug. And too many people who are in favor of Israel, when pressed to the logical conclusions of Israeli policies, you know, the fact that they have no intentions of negotiating for a peace treaty with the Palestinians, that they're going against every promise they've made to the United States, that they get more money from us than any other country, and that they routinely ignore every request that we make, they just shrug. And I would suggest that the United States is not a country that should be shrugged at, and no country survives into the next century by shrugging. I mean, you have to have a plan, and by there was an article in the Times talking about Netanyahu said that he's going to rely on Israel's military power for their survival, not a diplomatic solution with the Palestinians. This is dangerous. And when I've asked some of the students at Harvard and Israelis if they understand the necessities of Israel's security from a military point of view, they not only shrug, but they even ignore the advice of their own generals. It's not an accident that most of the Israeli peacemakers have been very decorated Israeli generals like Ehud Barak and Moshe Dayan and Ariel Sharon, whereas those who are most intransigent tend to be civilians. And we have our own chicken hawks here, people who've never worn a uniform, but cry war, whenever every chance they get, only they don't fight in it. The Israelis actually need the Palestinians living next door to them in the West Bank as human shields. Why do I say this? Because once they drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, which they've been trying to do by basically turning it into Berlin 1945, with the inaccurate comparison of the Palestinians to the Nazis. They are not Nazis.
And real quick on this point, so you keep referencing the Palestinians. Obviously, Hamas is the main target here. So can we just delineate between the two and give people a better understanding of the different, well, obviously
yes,
the different organizations within?
Yes, a lot of Palestinians were not pro Hamas. In fact, they resented the control that Hamas exerted on them. But if there weren't a lot of Hamas supporters before October 7th, there are a lot more now. I mean, the Israelis could destroy every single company that Hamas has raised, an army, but they will be replaced by people who are just as fanatical or more so than they were before the Roman Mongol brutality that they have inflicted on Gaza. I mean, there has been no restraint, although I've heard people say that they were so gentle to Gaza and they were going to cash in on it in negotiations with the Palestinians. That one blew my mind. But Hamas, they have created, they have demoralized the Palestinians into thinking about their future. But long term, the rage is not going to diminish. And Hamas, they said the same thing about the PLO. And now when things get more and more radical, they're going to wish that they had someone to negotiate with who was as willing to negotiate with them as the PLO was. And they talk about the guy they killed, the head of Hamas, because they cured his cancer. And they said, well, weren't we nice to cure his cancer? Well, of course, the oncologist who helped his cancer also worked for Shin Bet and asked and used his cancer to try to recruit him for Israeli intelligence. So, and then they put it around how ungrateful this guy was that he stood up for his people. I mean, if I were, you know, had cancer and I was treated by Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping for my cancer, no, I would not go work for the Russians or the Chinese.
Are you saying you turn, John? Is that what you'd
Yeah,
say?
right, really.
And also, before we keep this going, you've mentioned the POL and you've also mentioned Shin Bet and Mossad. Can we break down some of those real quick? Because I'm not sure
Oh,
that
sorry.
the vast majority of people listening probably have a kind of a
Yeah,
hard
sorry
time,
about that.
yeah,
The
deciphering what
Israelis
those are.
they have many arms of intelligence. And I can, on another show, I can tell you about how Israeli intelligence works. But the three biggest organizations, one is obviously the IDF's, or Israeli Army's military intelligence. The second is Mossad, which is their civilian intelligence arm. There's a saying in Israel, every spy a prince, and their principal intelligence officers are called Katzes. And at any one time, there are only between 50 and 100 Katzes, supreme, Israeli spies who are spy masters. And there are people who work for them, but they are all, functionaries. I mean, whether they're secretaries or assassins or people who listen on radios or just people who in America who keep a car that they can use for an operation here in their garage underneath their apartment. Those people are not Katzes. They're just people who want to help Israel, and they can get a phone call and they do little things for the Israeli intelligence. And it's a very large network, but there are only about somewhere between 45 and 85 Katzes. And then there's Shin Bet. And Shin Bet's job is the security of the Israeli security in the occupied territories. Keeping an eye on every single person who lives in Gaza and the West Bank and in the Golan Heights, and what their names are, their political views, their affiliation, where they live, where they went to school, all that stuff. So those are the three biggest. Shin Bet it's not like the FBI. It's more of a military intelligence occupation force,
Right.
but run by civilians. The Mossad, which is like the Israeli CIA, and military intelligence, which is part of the IDF.
Got
So
it.
those are the three big, arms of Israeli intelligence. And then they have very strong relations with different countries. I mean, they run, for example, if there's a phone call made in Europe, it goes to Denmark. I don't know how that got started. They and in Holland, they have a doctor who gives, because they get VD all the time. I don't know, but anyway, the every spy prince that they get around, they live the good life when they're not defending Israel's security. But it's a very well managed organization. I mean, these people are not fools.
Right.
So those are the big three.
I just wanted to make sure we broke that down properly for those that are listening, because
Thank you. Yeah,
as a lot of this gets thrown out there too. It
right.
can be difficult to follow. There's a lot going on. Also, I have a it seems as though, and I know you're just trying to provide as much information as possible. A lot of this has been I don't know that it's not anti-Israel, but it's maybe anti the way they're going about what they're doing.
Well,
And
there's a narrative out there of Israel being this innocent actor, inexplicably attacked by people who just hate them for no good reason. And it is a fight over land. And what I was going after before about the need for Israel to have Palestinians living next to them is that the West Bank was captured by Moshe Dayan in 1967 to give Israel strategic depth in an era of tank warfare. But now we are in an era of nuclear tipped missiles. And if someone like Iran or Pakistan, because Pakistan has nuclear weapons financed by the Saudis, hurls a nuclear weapon at Israel now, they will inevitably kill millions of Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza. So they can't nuke Israel. If, on the other hand, Israel drives the Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank, and only Israeli Jews are living in those places, then the Muslim fanatics could hurl nuclear weapons at Israel and the occupied territories and only kill Jews, which would be a tragedy because Jews have always been on the list of persecuted people. Jews need a place to go when they're persecuted. And by driving the Arab Muslim Palestinians out of their land, they are creating a lucrative target for Muslim fanatics to attack them. And I am criticizing Israel a lot, but I know it needs to exist, and that it has, by refusing to negotiate in good faith for the past 30 years, during which America's global power was unassailable. They could have got a very good deal, and the United States could have used its power to habituate the extremists on both sides to living in peace with the Israelis, and the extremists on the Israeli side to living in peace with the Palestinians. That time has been squandered. And a lot of Israelis on the political right are relying on Americans in the political right, and particularly in the Republican Party, and in particularly evangelical Christians who believe Israel's founding date in 1948 as the beginning of the ticking clock on the end times, as described by the Bible and Revelations. But I think this is a very dangerous bet, because the American right wing is already trafficking in anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, citing George Soros, the Rothschild family, and Donald Trump has derived considerable support from the Israeli right wing. But if anyone in this earth is capable of flipping on you, it is Donald Trump, who has got considerable support from the Christian evangelicals, and is, I mean, over 10 years ago, the Republican Party was the hawk party against the Russians for different reasons we know about, having to do with Vladimir Putin. Now Trump is pro-Russian, and he has dragged the Republican Party with them. It would not take much to change the Republican litmus test to being anti-Jewish and anti-Israel with Donald Trump in the White House. And this is something, as I fear, as much as I believe the Israelis are jeopardizing their future by not making peace in a sea of 100 million Arabs and Muslims, hundreds of millions of Arabs, and entrusting Donald Trump and the American right wing, which is already having a love affair with Putin, who's virulently anti-Semitic, Viktor Orban of Hungary, who's virulently anti-Semitic, all of the right wing in Germany and the Netherlands and in Austria, they're all talking anti-Jewish. Makes me very uncomfortable. So, but they keep telling me, oh, we have the Christian evangelicals and the American right wing. I don't think they're the people you want to count on. And by accepting 3 invitations to speak to the American Congress by the Republicans, Netanyahu has not only alienated the permanent professional national security establishment in the United States, but by accepting the invitation to criticize Democrats in a presidential election year, Netanyahu's turned Israel and the Israel consensus in the United States into a partisan issue, when it used to be that we were all for Israel. And young people don't have the same emotional commitment to Israel's security that my generation has. And they don't even know history. You ask them, you mention the Holocaust to them, and they either become irritated or they say, "What's that?" And I have to remind them of the horrors, committed against the Jews. And uh, but these QAnon and evangelical people, they start talking about the same tropes against the Jews that led to disaster under Hitler. So, but Netanyahu is not about details, and he's a narcissist, and he by identifying his own fate with all Jews and saying that if you're against him, you must be anti-Semitic. He is provoking a backlash on Jews because he's turning Jews into his own personal human shields. And as a president of a Jewish fraternity, I do not like that. And even though I'm not Jewish, I'm pro-Jewish, although it probably doesn't sound like I am, but I am. But, the situation on the ground requires an awareness of the details. And if you want to know the details of Israel's security, I suggest you look up Haaretz, Haaratz, and the works of the Israeli generals, who are much more sensitive to Israeli security than the civilian fanatics who preach biblical prophecy and, use that as the right to take over the Palestinians' land, which, as I've said, creates a very dangerous lucrative nuclear target. And heaven help us if American global power collapses, because Israel is, and Saudi Arabia, most of those regimes over there are indulgences of American global power. And if, to the extent that American global power is being diminished, to the extent that he has undermined the power and the prestige of our permanent national security establishment, which sees itself as maintaining our security alliances despite the changes in the political flavor of our alliances. He's undermining the people who keep the commitment to Israel's security, because Israel and the United States do not have a treaty, a mutual defense treaty. Only the moral obligation of the American national security establishment keeps that going. And Trump and Israel and Netanyahu has alienated that. I mean, and even I talked to some kids on campus, and when the State Department asked the Israeli right wing to stop telling their pro-Zionist students, the extremists on the college campuses, to stop hunting pro-Palestinian kids, they not only did not do so, but they started doxing them and denouncing them to future employers, which means that they're to breed a whole generation of anti-Semites for generations, which is horrible. So, it's like when John Mearsheimer wrote his book on the Israeli lobby and, said that the Israelis are doing these policies because they can, because they've got so much political power in Congress. Mearsheimer was denounced but Netanyahu believes in the Mearsheimer thesis and is using it to the point of its breaking point. And he's practically shattering the pro-Israel consensus in the United States. That's very dangerous, because we have to help Israel survive, but he has equated Israel's survival to his own survival.
So, John,
And
I'm gonna just real quick. I'm gonna kind of go back here. What I appreciate the most about our conversations is always that you and I don't align on everything politically, but at the end of the day, we get to have these conversations and delve into the perspective and the strategy that you're thinking through. Obviously, your perspective is invaluable, but also as it relates to strategy, I don't think many people are thinking through what you just unfolded for us, right?
Well,
And what
that's
you
why I'm saying it, so that
right,
people are aware of the
right,
danger that they're
but
courting by
when we
not.
started the podcast, it obviously was very like anti a lot of what Israel's doing, anti their political figures. It very much so thinking to myself, okay, are we getting into this as a very anti Israel podcast? And the more that we've gone through this, the more I obviously realized you are as pro Israel as possible, and your reasons being are that mainly we want to make sure that we think about the long term strategic protection of Israel
Yes.
in a different way than what maybe people are thinking of. Because when we think of October 7th, we think of the Hamas attacks on Israel. We ultimately, a lot of people don't have the other context, right? Which you are obviously providing throughout this entire conversation. It's amazing, but don't have the context that you have, and don't have the information that you have to be able to think through it as strategically. Um, so as it relates to what the ideal scenario is for Israel and their growth and their stability and their protection, where do you draw the line in the sand? I guess that's the question, right? At the end of the day, because it
Well,
with the destruction of Gaza, with the destruction, well, the planned destruction of Hamas, potential
that's
annexation of the
accomplished.
right,
They're all dead.
the right,
They're
well,
all dead. I mean,
well,
Gaza's
the
destroyed. Hamas is I mean, they're all dead.
right.
What will
So
emerge will be different people with the same wine, which is new bottles.
if they're dead, and I'm just if they're dead, who is negotiating for them right now?
Well, no one is someone more extreme will emerge. That's what I don't like. I mean, everyone's going to hope that the Palestinian National Authority, which is the PLO, will be an acceptable negotiator. Now, Arabs, I mean, Netanyahu spent so much time humiliating and degrading their prestige that Palestinians may not be willing to, you know, agree to the concessions that the PNA makes. But if the PNA delivers the goods, then the Palestinians will go along.
I have to stop
But
you one more time. The PLO and the PNA. Can you describe those?
The PLO, the PLO negotiated the Oslo Accords of 1994, and what came out of that was the political administrative organization that runs the West Bank. We
Right.
call that the Palestinian National Authority, headquartered in Ramallah. Netanyahu thought it was clever to divide and rule, divide and conquer, to divide the Palestinians by making the West Bank the province of the PLO slash PNA, and Gaza the part of Palestine that was run by Hamas.
Right.
And then so that divided the Palestinians in two, and then he got to see the Hamas wants the river to the sea. They're impossible. There's no negotiating with them. We've got to destroy them. That was the strategy. And now that the Hamas is destroyed, its command structure has been destroyed, and the only people willing to negotiate with the Israelis are in the PNA. We're going to have to talk to the PNA. But right now, Netanyahu says he doesn't want to talk to the PNA, and he doesn't want to have a Palestinian state. And a lot of Israelis think it's an intolerable gun to their head. But if the logical conclusion of what they're doing is they're going to drive all the Palestinians out, which creates a lucrative target, which is dangerous. And at a certain point, the United States will tire of protecting them, which I don't want. I want us to protect them. But that the Israeli settlers are going to have to be removed from the West Bank, and there is no consensus in Israel for that to happen. So I mean, that has to be the future if you want peace, with the Palestinians. But Netanyahu's been trying to go around that by normalizing relations with all the Arab states and telling the Palestinians, you're out. No one cares about you. Live with it or die with it.
Right.
And that's not good for the United States for a variety of reasons. War with China is coming. And we're going to need, and the Chinese are going to sponsor a war of revenge among Muslims and Arabs against us. We need them on our side. We cannot, it's not possible. If you've demonized and bombed someone for 50 years, you cannot surge an alliance with an entire civilization. And we have in the Middle East, we have effectively outsourced our strategy in the Middle East to Saudi Arabia and to Israel. If you just listen to the debates you'll hear on talk shows in America, ask any question and people will say, well, that will affect Israel or that will affect the Saudis. Forgetting, wait a minute, we support the Saudis and the Israelis because we're supposed to get things from them. They're supposed to be America's imperial instruments in the region. We are not supposed to be theirs. That balance has been perverted. We have become their tools instead of the reverse. And as someone who wants American policy in America for American purposes, I want the Saudis to be worrying about what we want. And I want the Israelis trembling at our displeasure, not the reverse. But, that's where we are.
You
So
mentioned
in the
China.
future, we have to retake control of America's policy in the Middle East from Saudi Arabia and Israel.
You also referenced war with China, and this is something that we are planning on covering in a future episode. So I don't want to get too much into it. But as it relates to Chinese influence in the Israeli-Gaza conflict, what has their
They and
involvement?
the Iranians have been very helpful with missiles and weapons for Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. The Chinese brokered a truce between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They have been very helpful to the Syrian regime, although uh, our efforts in Ukraine's behalf have so absorbed Russia's bandwidth and her power that Russia's influence in the former Soviet Union states of Central Asia has collapsed, as evidenced by the surge of Chinese influence in its Belt and Road Initiative in Soviet Central Asia, the fact that the Russian protectorate in Armenia, they had to surrender their province, their Armenian ethnic province of Nagorno-Karabakh to the Azerbaijanis, who are allied to the Iranians. The Armenians pleaded for help from the Russians. They said, sorry, we're too wrapped up in Ukraine. You're on your own. And of course, Syria was totally dependent on Russian help to survive the Assad regime. The Russians couldn't help them there. So the American effort again in Ukraine has wholly absorbed Russian power. It is, I mean, if the United States really did want to invade Russia, it could go north of Ukraine through Belarus, go south to the stand countries of Central Asia. Russia's back door is wide open for Chinese invasion in Siberia. Uh, uh, and of course, Russia's wholly mortgaged its economic sovereignty to the Chinese. So, uh, so we have not only lost a strategic initiative in the Middle East and Central Asia to China, but so have the Russians. And the Chinese are surging their influence in that region. Pakistan and Iran and the Emirati Gulf petro monarchies, and they're making friends and weapons deals, building ports and other things. And either Hutchison Whampoa, last time I looked, the formerly a British Hong Kongese port, now owned by the Chinese, is running the Suez Canal. People keep talking about how we could cut the Egyptians for their money because they want all our money. Well, what money is that? We're in hock to the world to the tune of trillions of dollars. And there are lots of other countries that can give Egypt money, namely the Chinese, who are surging their influence in the region because we've outsourced our policy to Saudis and the Israelis. And the Russian influence that did exist has collapsed utterly because of its exhaustion in the war in Ukraine. So, if we're going to have a future, we have to retake our policy, and we have to realize that Russian influence in the region is a fiction. In fact, our own power in the Middle East is a fiction. Beneath our military bases, we are a one-dimensional power in the Middle East. We have no political power. We have lost control of the historical narrative. We have even lost control of our own historical narrative. I mean, when people read about American history, it's from the disgusting Howard Zinn and his People's History of the United States, and the horrible Noam Chomsky, who've convinced our own young people as well as the world that America's ideals are all a con. Well, they aren't a con, but that's because we don't have a soft power strategy in the region, and because our political influence is a fiction, because the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Israelis, our senators and congressmen, when they set up their lobbying shingles, they were all panting after Saudi and Kuwaiti and Emirati and even Chinese clients, when it should be the reverse. I mean, so we don't have a strategy in the Middle East. We have to have one. I mean, I'm prepared to discuss that. But first, I had to talk about how we are ignored, our power is being used, and there is hardly any way, and we haven't alienated.
So,
we have a lot of power militarily, but beneath that, we don't have any control over the narrative on the street.
so what is the move in the Middle East? Moving forward, once again, kind of in an ideal world and from a strategic perspective, if moving forward you were in charge of strategy for U.S. government relations, U.S. foreign relations, what would you do?
Well, first of all, we have to basically, we cannot trust the Israelis to negotiate in good faith with the Palestinians for a state for the Palestinians. I'll describe what they do in their negotiations. Every president goes for their legacy play in the last 2 years of their administration. They do their Middle East peace thing. The Israelis are very sophisticated, and they have this down to a science. And they run out the clock on the Americans. That's what we're called, the Americans, not our friends, not our great patrons, not our protectors, the Americans. So first, they use up as much time as they can describing horrible Palestinian terror tactics on some Israeli victim who's a Frank Capra nice person, and we feel real badly about that. And then once that's done, then they go to the next phase, which is they demand that the Palestinians make all sorts of security protocols to encompass every possible security risk to the Israeli settlers on the West Bank. And they contrive endless scenarios that the Palestinians are supposed to reassure them on. And that uses up weeks. And until someone says, wait a minute, you people aren't supposed to be on the West Bank anyway. You promised you wouldn't be. You said you'd withdraw. And then when that happens, then the Israelis are a temper tantrum. They start packing their bags. Some of them even do fake anxiety attacks, and they threaten to leave. And by the time we get into real protocols for withdrawals, the Americans have run out, their political clock is gone. And the narrative is put out, the Palestinians would have got their deal if they only had made one more concession. It's the whole thing is a kabuki play. And unless we reverse that, we will have no prestige, no credibility as a tribune and an honest broker in the region at all. Secondly, we have to retake our influence from the Saudis. The Saudis have spent $1 trillion radicalizing every mosque in the world and to their Wahhabist Salafist version of Islam, which the original jurists of Islam denounced as a heresy. So they're a bunch of Taliban nuts. Basically, that was done back in the 19th and early 20th century. But the Saudis, especially after the Iranian Revolution, decided they had to get religious liberty. So they bought off the family, I forget the family's name in Saudi or in the Arabian Peninsula, that is the custodian of this Salafist radical version of Islam, to say we should rule forever, say we're good guys, and we'll finance your mosques. And so this has radicalized Islam, everywhere in the world. And we have done nothing to stop it. And the Saudis didn't even repress their own radical Muslims until we put several divisions in Iraq, next door in the Anbar province of Saudi Arabia, next to the Saudi border. Then the Saudis got nervous that we were going to invade them. Well, frankly, we should tell the Saudis who's boss. They're not the original legitimate protectors of the holy places, known as the Sharifs of Mecca and Medina. The original Sharifs are the Hashemite family, who are direct descendants of the Prophet. They are the rulers of Jordan. His Majesty the King Abdullah II is a Hashemite, a direct descendant of the Prophet. He is a more liberal custodian of Islam. If his people were running the Hijaz, which is the region of Saudi Arabia that where the Mecca and Medina are, we would not have as much radicalism, and all that money wouldn't be going to radical mosques. And the Saudis keep trying to get rid of their feeling of embarrassment that we protect them by calling American soldiers mercenaries, which really irritates me and my army friends. And we should secure a change of leadership in that country. I don't think much of Mohammed bin Salman, who is just as contemptuous of us as Netanyahu. And there's a famous picture of he and Vladimir Putin vigorously shaking hands with a big smile on how they put one over on the Americans. I didn't like that. And we have to do a soft power strategy in that region because the Saudis and the
Before we dive into
Emiratis.
that, can you explain to people the difference between, well, really what soft
Oh,
power
yes,
is?
sorry. Well, it's hard to believe, but back in the 8th century, Islam was a liberal empire. I'll give you one example. If a woman were accused of adultery, she was not guilty unless 4 men testified that she was guilty. The Salafists have turned that doctrine on its head to say that any man can accuse a woman of adultery, and unless she is exonerated by 4 men, she's automatically guilty, which is, unfair to say the least. But that gives you an idea of how Islam has been twisted into a horrifying, fanatical version of Islam that we're living and dying with today. The Emiratis are so unsure of their legitimacy as rulers that they are constantly paying off these radicals who are basically in a religious protection racket, saying that we'll denounce you unless you, give the most radical of our imams money. And when I surveyed a mosque in Cambridge and interviewed a bunch of their worshippers, I met 40-year-old men who were indeed virgins because of their radical interpretation of Islam. 40-year-old virgin. Well, no wonder you're blowing stuff up. Um, so this is the kind of uh, fanaticism that is bred by a combination of repression, sexual frustration, the fact that the vast majority of people who are ruled by these countries have no say in the way they are governed. They have little to no freedom or agency in their private lives, because when you've got a regime that uses the morality card to control your personal life, that includes inside your house. And if a regime controls everything you do inside your own household, it basically has eliminated any free space or freedom of any kind in life in your society at all. And that's the kind of control that these imams want. And they've got an unlimited supply of oil money to pay imams who preach this, who pay suicide bombers, who do actually ensure their families of some financial security, because these poor kids, of course, it's never the rich kids who do it, are persuaded to kill themselves and other people, and then their families get a huge amount of money, and once their families do that, they buy their way into Europe or the United States. So it's a version of Islam that cannot reconcile itself with life and is not a wave of the future. But that's the version of Islam that prevails in the Gulf. It is not the version of Islam that prevails in place, even in Cairo, where the Mujahideen and the Muslim Brotherhood is still powerful, but the influence of cosmopolitan scholars who have been educated in the West, who talk with the West, have much more political influence and social influence. And there's a saying in the Middle East that books are written in Cairo, published in Beirut, and read in Iraq. And if the United States had a covert plan to subsidize the cosmopolitan intellectuals of Cairo and Lebanon, we could subsidize and help the intellectuals of Arabia and Islam take back the cultural narrative from the fanatics of the Gulf, who substitute extremism for the fact that they've only been out of the desert for about 3 generations and have no real prestige as intellectuals, unlike the intellectuals of Cairo, where the United States also has another university, the American University of Cairo. We can't out-argue these people, but the intellectuals of Cairo can, and of Beirut, but no one's subsidizing them. If the United States does, we could get a reconciliation of the West and Islam, a democracy in Islam, and life and death. And that's an example of soft power strategy that we have not tried, because we have persisted in this belief that all Arabs and Muslims are nothing but terrorists. But if you travel there, especially in old Arabia, where the Levant and Egypt and Jordan and people are much more cosmopolitan and secular, you'll find that they watch American movies and TV and do not subscribe at all to the wingnuts who get all these millions of dollars of subsidies from the Gulf oil monarchies, who only give them money because they're afraid of them.
Another direction I'd like to take this into is better understanding Iran's involvement in all of the above. You've mentioned it a few times, but I think giving the people that are listening a better understanding of the Iranian involvement in all the above would just be super beneficial, and better understanding the conflict specifically between Gaza and Israel,
So the Iranians
Palestine.
armed Hamas. They're the people. The Iranian people are the most pro-American people in the Middle East. You put out, you go to an Iranian soccer game and someone pulls out an American flag, the whole crowd cheers, and the Iranian police try to capture it, and people pass it around and show it up, you know. But the Iranian regime is no friend of ours, uh, and and they are arming the Russians, and they are arming terrorists who want to bomb us, and the Chinese are loving this, and they are sharing their missile technology with the Iranians, and their drone technology, and of course they're sharing drone technology with the Russians, and drones with Hamas, uh, and uh, and with Hezbollah and the Houthis. They are very dangerous uh, regime. The difference between the Arab petro monarchies and the Iranian regime is that we could go in with our military and topple any one of the oil petro monarchies in the Gulf in a day. That would not be possible in Iran because the Iranian Islamic Republic is like Persian society. It is because it's Persia. It is a vast, deep, truly ancient civilization, and the regime's tentacles and its support, even though most of the people are pro-American, are dispersed. They are extensive. They are deeply organized. They have block committees on in every neighborhood of Iran. They have these. I could we could have another meeting about talking about the Iranian uh, the regime, the structure of the regime.
I think I
But
think it'd be a great idea. Really good friend of mine is from Iran, and he's actually the only reason I know that the Iranians actually the vast majority actually like America is because of him and the knowledge that he's shared with me over the years. But I wouldn't have known that otherwise. I think what's also be interesting to do is a full episode on just the structure of Iran in general. I am curious to know about these two Supreme
we
Court
couldn't knock it
members.
over. We couldn't
Sorry?
knock it over. That what I'm saying is we couldn't knock it over.
Yeah.
I mean, if we attacked it, even the people who are on our side would be indignant, at us bombing them, and and find it inexplicable that we don't understand that they like us. But the regime has its tentacles everywhere, and even if the Ayatollah Khamenei died, the IRGC is so big. It's not just like the Russian secret police, which was scared of Stalin as as it scared. They scare Khamenei. The IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, is as powerful as the mullahs. They are their own state within a state.
Yeah.
So knocking over the Iranian regime would not be easy. Sorry to interrupt there.
No, I was kind of following up on current events though. The two Supreme Court members in Iran that were just murdered. It did that have anything to do with? Frankly, I have not read enough about it yet, but I just wanted to know if you knew anything about that situation and maybe what happened there.
I don't.
Okay.
If two Iranian Supreme Court, they might have been the Guardian Council or the Expediency Committee. I mean, as I say, it would be an episode to just describe the structure of the regime.
Right.
It is more likely that someone had it in for someone inside Iran, and they murdered them as part
Took
of
them out.
some sort of
Yeah.
plot.
Well, and
I
I think
mean,
bringing Iran into the mix is obviously super important, obviously as it relates to Israel, and Hamas, the Palestinians, Gaza, etc. Because obviously during all of this, Iran has also fired on Israel directly a number of
yes,
times,
it has. Yes, it
and
has.
I'd like to kind of break that down a little bit because it always seems as though the strategy is to show force but not cause destruction. knowing that the Iron Dome is going to basically intercept the vast majority of the missiles. Is that a correct assumption? Obviously, they want to show that they are responding and they're showing force, and they don't want to cause too much destruction because they don't want all out war. Um, what is
Correct.
maybe the reasoning for that? Is that
They
correct?
don't want an all-out war.
Yep.
I mean, Netanyahu has been trying to get us into an all-out war for 30 years. I mean, part of his brutality against Gaza was in hope that it would provoke the Iranians into an all-out attack, which of course was supplemented by the attacks by the Houthis on our shipping, and that he would drag us into a war. But neither the Iranians nor President Biden would fall for that one. The last thing we need is a war with Iran, because the Israelis would be with us in the first two waves of airstrikes against Iran, but we would be left holding the can for a 10-year war with Iran when we need to be building up our strength for the war with China. We do not need a war with Iran. And but the Iranians did their bit to show their solidarity, but they were too smart to be drawn into an all-out war with Israel. And we exerted that was a red line for Biden. He did tell the Netanyahu, no, you can't, we're not going to do an all-out war with the Iranians. So you're right about that.
Wonderful. Um, that's in kind of covering that particular topic. Is there anything else that we have not discussed
Oh,
that
God,
needs
yes.
to be hit on as it relates to, let's say, specifically Israel and Gaza? We
Yeah,
talked a
yeah.
lot of
Let me
this. A
look.
lot of this is very Middle Eastern focused, but this particular conflict, what else do people need to know? Or where should they get their information as it relates to these things moving forward? Because once again, a lot of this is not information that I feel like a lot of us consume on a daily basis. These are interesting opinions and perspectives, and I once again greatly appreciate you hopping on to discuss them. But what else is there to discuss on this matter?
Well, there's a lot. I'll have to look at my notes here. I mean, the reason people haven't heard this stuff is because it's not like the information isn't there. You have to look for it. You have to read the Times.
Yep.
And I would also recommend the Atlantic, um, which was founded in my town, Concord, Massachusetts. Uh, uh, that's kind of America's. If America had a magazine for an American empire, I think the Atlantic would be it. Um, I would recommend Rand Corporation. I would the Defense Department has a profusion, and the Rand Corporation, which is run by the Defense Department, they have a tremendous number of reports on all of these issues, which are all free, which you can subscribe to from the U.S. government, that will tell you all about this stuff. I would recommend Haaretz, which is an Israeli publication, HAARETZ .com, which I've subscribed to. Um, uh, there's, there, the Middle East people, Americans don't know this stuff because Americans are concerned about what's going on in America.
Yeah.
And
Well,
they only hear a small narrative about, Israel being this small country in a sea of hatred, and that's all they know. But when we talk about this stuff, we find out that there are a lot more details into what goes on than you would know, just, you know, but it takes some work to find that stuff out. And a lot of what I've said, doesn't suit well because it doesn't fit into a simple narrative. And they will even say, John, you're complicating things. I can assure you that the Middle East is complicated all on its own. Doesn't need me to
it
complicate it.
doesn't need you to complicate
No,
it
but
at
by
all.
describing the complexity, I'm not, complicating it. I'm just, I may not tell you what you want to hear, but I can assure you, if you're on the ground in the Middle East, um, you know, you're up to your neck in complexity.
Right.
and it isn't fun for people. Let me just look here. Um, uh, it's I can tell you one thing. When I volunteered for Iraq, and and I uh, I defended our second occupation of Iraq, um, on Arab soil. I am probably still the only, although I admit we totally mismanaged that war. I'm probably one of the only people on the East Coast who still favors the war in Iraq, both of them, and volunteered to go there 4 times, and still wishes we could have turned it into a protectorate state. In fact, when I talked to the Arabs, they said, why are you in Iraq? I said, because it's the most strategic country in the Middle East. Its Anbar province has more oil than Saudi Arabia and Iran put together. And I want it to be, you know, uh, an American protectorate party. They said, oh, an American we could talk to. We like this. And you know what the Arabs wanted? They wanted to know if we were going to make Iraq into the next Germany or South Korea or Japan. That's what they had even watched the wonderful 1960s movie, The Mouse That Roared, that said that all you had to do is declare war on the United States, lose it, and the Americans would come in and fix your economy at their expense. That's what they wanted. And when I said that that was not on the agenda, they were indignant. And I know it wasn't on Rumsfeld's agenda, because when he was running for president, I had breakfast with him in one of his old men's clubs in Boston. And he didn't think much of me. I didn't think much of him either. And I said, asked him if he had considered this. And he looked at me like I was, off my head. I said, well, this is what they want. And he said, no, no, no. And Rumsfeld fancied himself a great strategist, but and he was all for this the transformation of the military, which he totally flubbed. He did a McKinsey study to reduce the number of crewmen on every ship, to give every crewman 7 or 8 different functions, which means that if any take casualties, huge gaps in a naval vessel's execution skills emerge, and the ship can't function. And if you've noticed that in the Navy several years ago, American U.S. naval vessels were crashing into each other in Northeast Asia, was because the ships were so exhausted, the crews were so exhausted, they were bumping into each other. That was Rumsfeld following McKinsey. And, trying to tell him this was like talking to a wall. And he tried to soften every story by referring to people as folks. And every story was cute. And by the time we left the breakfast, and we walked out the front door of this club, which Eddie Murphy invaded in one of a wonderful movie, Trading Places, you got the feeling that if he saw a child and writhing in pain on the sidewalk, he'd step over the child and say, that reminds me of a cute story about some folks. I mean, he's a hard man. Uh, and he's just, he didn't realize that by controlling the oil of the Middle East, if the Chinese start, continue with, embargoing rare earth metals on us, and pharmaceuticals, and certain other manufactured goods, we would have our foot on their throats by cutting off their oil supply, which was my agenda, which I told him. And I had, no qualms at all about exerting this imperial power. And because these oil monarchies are there because we protect them, and they ought to do what we tell them to do, and no arguments. Well, he became one of their lobbyists, so I didn't think much of his patriotism. And uh, by controlling Iraq, not only would we have, control the entire region and China's oil supply, but we would have avoided all of these civil wars, And the migrants would have been going to Iraq to live the American way, because we would be extending the American empire there, instead of their coming to our shores in Europe and destabilizing our politics. And none of this made any impression on Rumsfeld. If you can't tell, I really dislike the guy. Jerry Bremer was a jerk too. I met him in New Canaan, Connecticut. He was an empty suit. Anyway, we
Well,
totally mismanaged that.
and Rumsfeld passed away in what, 2021? Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. And he used to go to a farm for a weekend to relax. He obviously didn't believe in ghosts, because the heritage of this farm was, if you were a slave owner and you had an incorrigible slave, you sent your slave to this farm to be tortured and broken. Now, if you believe in ghosts and the idea of screams haunting your thoughts, that was the house that Rumsfeld bought to relax in. So obviously he doesn't care about torture or whatever. And when you saw the business at Abu Ghraib, you could see that the total lack of professionalism in the interrogators. As soon as I saw that picture of that Laurie England with a leash, I said, they're having amateurs do the interrogation. That's when, and when, what was it? Halliburton had their recruiting events at hotels. They would ask people why they were going to Iraq, and they wouldn't say, to spread democracy, because it's strategic. They were all coached to yell for the money, and that's what it was for Rumsfeld and for Cheney and for these people, for the money. And Cheney built many of the building blocks for an authoritarian state. It is hugely ironic that his daughter is passing herself off as the anti-dictator Republican, because her father created many of these emergency powers that Trump is now going to use. So if ever there was a war that was mismanaged worse in both Iraq and Afghanistan, those two guys flubbed it. And they didn't listen. And the Iraqis and the Lebanese and the Jordanians, they were willing to help us. And there was a reason that the Arab Street did not rise when we invaded Iraq. They hoped to be the next South Korea. There was no accident that it rose when Obama pulled out of Iraq in 2009. That's when they realized we didn't care about them. And the other thing they said to me was, if Hosni Mubarak and Hafez al-Assad put their knucklehead sons on the throne, so to speak, they were going to rise up. And they told me that they would, and they did. That's why the Arab Spring happened when it did, when we allowed these two people to create dynastic dictatorships, and we abandoned the Iraqis to their fates and spent entirely too much money and blood in Afghanistan, which the idea of modernizing Afghanistan into a modern Jeffersonian democracy is so ridiculous. I mean, all we could ever hope to do there was keep Al Qaeda or ISIS from taking root and, doing whack-a-mole. The money should have been spent in Iraq. And yes, it didn't. Saddam Hussein had no operational relationship with Al Qaeda, but I did not want to invade Iraq because of Al Qaeda. I wanted to invade Iraq for the reasons I just said, and because Saddam was weak and I wanted to take him on when he was weak. And had we not done so, we would now be facing an Iraq nuclear program like an Iranian nuclear program or a North Korean nuclear program. It's true that he had no nuclear weapons before we invaded, but it was not true that everyone knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction. not only because uh, we did not have the evidence, but went out of his way to make it look like he did have these weapons because he wanted everyone to fear him. And there's a very good book by Stephen Cole on this misperception, and he also uh, knew that the French and the Germans and the Russians were gutting the sanctions regime. And actually, when we invaded, the sanctions regime was about 20 minutes away from collapsing completely. Immediately after the sanctions regime collapsed, um, every country in the Middle East would have gone to pilgrimages to kiss Saddam's ring because A, they thought he had nuclear weapons because he made sure everyone thought that, and also because he was going to reconstitute his nuclear weapons, which is again in that Stephen Cole book. So by taking him on when he was weak, we avoided in Iraq with nuclear weapons like we face in North Korea and Iran and Pakistan. And we could have had a friendly Arab country there. But, and by the way, neither the Saudis nor the Israelis supported that effort, uh, showing that they do not hew to the American line strategically. Uh, so that was a tragedy. 30,000 Americans were maimed. All of them had PTSD, and over 4,500 men died because George Bush didn't know anything about global strategy, and he believed that Donald Rumsfeld did, and Cheney, all he cared about was oil. There's more to the Middle East than oil, and uh, the people were willing to help us. But when they saw that we didn't, that's when all of the oxygen went to the terrorists who do hate us and have done more to drive migrants in our direction than anyone else. The Arabs are not, and the Muslims are not all terrorists. In fact, the reason the migrants are coming here is to get away from those people.
Right.
So,
To take us not no just to take us back a little bit further, the
yeah.
9/11. Um, what are your what are your thoughts on 9/11? And I'm not gonna dive into the different conspiracies and all the. I'm just curious to know
Oh,
what
I
your
don't know about
thoughts are.
those. Yeah, either. Yeah.
Yeah.
I,
Uh,
I do know that I remember, I don't know where I was. I was talking to some Englishman. He said I was unusual to meet an educated American. That's what the English always say to Americans. Um, actually, every time I was in the Middle East, they would ask me if I were CIA, and I always said no. They were always indignant. Don't you want to know anything? They would ask. You should be CIA. I said, I'm not CIA. I was talking to this guy. He was an NCO from Special SAS, and his job was to look after the Bin Laden, the branch of the Bin Laden family that lived in New Jersey, but boogied down in Manhattan. And then there was another guy who dealt with the Bin Ladens in Boston, and the Bin Ladens were all over America, and they had a very intimate relationship with the Bush family, and they were protected after 9/11. I do know that the reason that I'm pretty sure that bin Laden hated this country was not just his adopted Islamic faith, because he was one of the dissolute, young, rich Arab. He was not Saudi, he was Yemeni, who boogied down in the discotheques of Europe. Um, these guys always become very religious once their parts fall apart and Viagra doesn't work for them anymore. And his father was a financial wizard, and when the uh, American dollar basically shrunk in its international trade weighted value to a quarter of what it was, um, it put the Saudi and the other oil monarchies into financial crisis. And eventually it led to their doing the oil embargo and surging oil prices. Now, politically, they conveniently used the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 as the reason, but really they increased the prices by 4 or 5-fold to offset the collapse in the trade-weighted value of the dollar. That's because when the British created these monarchies, they owed us a lot of money, and they pegged the dollar, all the oil sales to U.S. dollars, and the British controlled those oil sales, and they used the proceeds they made from those oil sales in dollars to pay us back the debt that they owed us for World War II. I mean, that was why the oil prices went up. But anyway, one of the guys who helped the Saudis get their financial house in order was bin Laden's father. He was a financial wizard. They rewarded him by giving him all sorts of contracts to build Saudi cities and different projects. He became indispensable. But it is always with the case of Saudi royal, or any royal families, they do not like indispensable people, especially people who think they're indispensable. So bin Laden's father mysteriously died on a plane crash. And bin Laden was convinced to the dying day that we and the Saudis had organized his father's death, hence his hatred for the United States. And one of the things that is a truism and has always been the truism in the Middle East is that everything is controlled by the CIA. The weather is controlled by the CIA. And whenever I tried to explain to people that everything, all these convoluted theories, when we did one screw up after another, were not part of a grand design, but because we didn't know what we were doing and we were confused, they refused to believe this. And I couldn't convince them. And but the biggest, they seem to kind of be disillusioned by that because they wanted to think someone was in control. But I got a lot of screaming phone calls during the first Trump administration because when people don't realize that the whole world has relied on American protection and America's driving the agenda much more than anyone realizes. Before every international conference or before any policy change, for example, these countries would call the United States, specifically the State Department desk that covered their region, the Far East region, the Near East desk, whatever, and say, we're thinking about changing our policy in the following way. What do you think of this? Is this okay with you? And we'd, tell them what we thought and would work with them and they'd work with us and then things would change. So all of the sovereign decisions were made in consultation with us. Nothing was decided without consulting the Americans, which is a pretty good thing to have if you're a global empire. And of course, the CIA was considered to be sort of the hammer that, without having to use the military, and if, someone was doing something wrong, the American president would task the CIA to deal with it. And we got rid of anyone who was a problem or whatever. This was the theory. But when Trump denounced the CIA in Helsinki, and the CIA didn't get rid of him, I got these phone calls saying how outraged these foreign friends were, saying that they had totally lost confidence in the CIA because you didn't get rid of Donald Trump. And I said, this is the deep state, of course, he keeps talking. I said, well, we really thought that if we leaked enough information about what he was doing, that the voting public would get concerned and vote him out. No, you Americans can't be that naive that people in the intelligence world actually think that, democracy works that way. said, yes, we really do. So you are this naive and you let your president bash you over the head and not. I said, well, yeah, I guess that's, well, we have, if that's the way it is, we have totally lost control in your confidence in your intelligence community. That has been the biggest blow to the prestige of the CIA I have seen in 50 years. So, I mean, if you ever wonder what people think of the CIA, that's an example of how they evaluate it. That we didn't, Oliver Stone wouldn't agree with this,
Yeah.
but Oliver Stone gets pretty much everything wrong.
I don't want to conclude this too early because there's a lot more we could discuss. But the one question I do want to ask, uh, as kind of well as our closing conversation, is as it relates to the Biden policy versus the Trump policy in the Middle East, specifically dealing with Israel and Gaza. What what do you think comes of this? Do you think it's better because of a Trump administration, worse because of a Trump administration? And do you think that a Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris,
I didn't think
uh,
much of Kamala Harris.
but do
She
you
was
do
an
you think she
empty.
would have handled this better? Do you think she would have
No,
handled the Middle East
I
better?
don't. No,
Okay,
I don't think she
so
would have.
and that once again to go back to the politics.
Yeah.
As it relates to Trump's administration this time around, last time around, uh, there was relative peace, right? Biden's
Well, no,
administration,
there wasn't relative peace. I mean, there's a lot of death
there,
that goes on in the Middle East and North
but
Africa.
le-
A
well,
lot of death.
but lesser conflicts because with America involved. Let's put it that way. That
No,
that actually,
there have been a lot
in
of
in
conflicts.
comparison to the Biden Harris administration,
No, no, there. I mean, Sudan, the Somalia, uh, Ethiopia, the Horn of Africa, Iraq, Syria,
still
Gaza, the
still right,
West Bank,
still a lot of conflict, still a lot. I'm just saying
Yemen.
in
The
comparison
whole
though.
place is on fire. There has been no peace before Biden.
Yep.
There's no peace after Biden. It is a mess.
So
And the reason is that we have outsourced our policy to the Saudis and to Israel. And Biden allowed Netanyahu to ignore him, which badly weakened Biden's political standing in the upper Midwest with Arab voters, and it made him look weak. And the first state visit that Trump did in his first term was to Saudi Arabia, which they gave him a huge yacht, a solid golden sword, and deposited millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars into his account, which he said didn't matter and wasn't against the emoluments or conflict of interest clause because he says he's exempt from those. I don't know how that is, but he is. But in other words, both presidents defer to the Saudis and the Israelis. We do not have our own policy there. We take land and oil from them, and we allow each regime to abuse the Arab people. And we have no friends there because we don't treat them like friends. And we are going to need them. You cannot surge a civilizational alliance after you've bombed it and ignored it and allowed turn them over to their tormentors. And so I see no difference between Biden or Trump or Harris. I mean,
so no difference
so
whatsoever in your opinion.
none. I mean,
Okay.
Trump wanted to get a Nobel Prize for the Abraham Accords, which was a betrayal of the Palestinians, and Biden wanted to do the Saudi deal, which was another betrayal, which provoked the Gaza war. I mean, it is, and every single country is experiencing terrible violence. There is no peace. When Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, was remarking on how peaceful everything was, I looked at
Not
people.
peaceful, not
What?
peaceful at all.
No. What peace are you
What piece are
talking?
you referring to? Which is back to my point, right? And I state this to say that the Ukraine Russia conflict the Gaza Israel, the Hamas Israel Gaza Israel conflict. There are a lot of these conflicts that have popped up during his administration. Now, concluding and or they are trying to conclude them in preparation for a Trump administration, the Trump administration.
Well,
It
yeah.
so th-
After Netanyahu did everything he wanted to do, it was no great concession to Trump to conclude a, a ceasefire. But I
I
don't
guess
see
my biggest
any
question is
big
do
change.
you give Trump the credit in that regard
I give him
for
that credit.
okay.
He got a ceasefire.
I know you don't like giving Trump credit on many things, but
Well, no, I mean, but that doesn't affect. I may not like the guy, but I'm not going to. If a strategic event is happening, it happens. I mean, so I have to give him credit.
right,
I don't allow that to affect my political or strategic judgment.
understood.
He got the ceasefire that Biden didn't get. So Trump deserves the credit.
Understood. Our next conversation is going to be a lot more focused on China. So I'm super excited about that conversation. Um, and I really appreciate you coming on tonight. This is once again, this is the first time we've actually done this, and there will be plenty more in the future, hopefully. I just appreciate you sharing and imparting your knowledge on the podcast, diving deep into what some may consider to be controversial topics and ideas. But overall, I just appreciate your strategic thinking that not many people think like that. Not many people actually have those perspectives and that outlook. That and obviously the context that you have too helps you to make those decisions and better understand the strategy overall. But I just overall appreciate you sharing that tonight on the
It was
podcast.
my pleasure. And, if anyone who's upset about hearing things they don't want to hear, I can assure you that I do not make stuff up to win an argument. And I would I would recommend that you, before you get mad and criticize, go ask some Arabs and go ask some Israelis and do some serious reading and find out, independently, you know, um, what's going on, and listen to informed people. I mean, not people who know the talking points, and you can learn something. And remember, if you're on trial for your life, um, which is what we are all in foreign policy, national security policy. It's about surviving into the next century, not telling us what we want to hear. And if you're on trial for your life or on a murder charge, do you want the person who's defending you to tell you what you want to hear? Or do you want him to know what he's talking about and get you off of the charge? And um, both sides, I think, would rather have my kind of brain defending their interests than someone who tells them what they want to hear. Although, sometimes it's a little bit kind of hard nosed and cold blooded for people. I admit that. Not too many people openly admit to wanting to invade other countries and talk about them being imperial protectorates. And
It's a little bit easier hearing that you're not going to get the death penalty, right? So
well, that's true. And telling Arabs that I like invading their countries and want to be an emperor, that was controversial, but well,
well, that might be the strange part.
eclectic.
Well, the biggest part of this, what I'm really trying to accomplish with this podcast is getting the different opinions and the different viewpoints and talking about the controversial topics.
And
So
you
that
do that very well.
and really focusing on getting the unique perspective that people need in order to form a better opinion of what's actually going on.
Well, right.
Um,
If you know more about what's going on out there, you can not only be a better informed citizen, but you can plan your own life. And I'll end with one thing. If you can travel in the next 5 years, do so while you still have a chance. There are a lot of beautiful places to see in this world. And you don't want to miss them because you thought there was always time to travel, because there won't be. Unfortunately, we may have a war. I pray not, but
let's hope not, but also prepare for the worst at the end of the day.
yes. All
Awesome.
right.
Well,
Well,
we'll be doing
have
a
a
lot
good
more
evening.
traveling, and John, looking forward to the next episode.
Me too. Bye bye.